Good morning, all, and happy Friday. It's going to be our last-ish lecture before the review. I think part of the today's material, part of the preserving biodiversity topic is going to transfer to Monday, half of Monday's lecture, but it's all should be much easier compared to lectures early in the semester. I hope you perceive it that way too. I tried to organize the material since the spring break is obnoxiously late in the semester. I tried to organize material so that the easiest parts of the topics are closer to the end. Um, all right. So, any questions before I get started? Okay. So, reminder, quiz
All right,
11.
Professor, I have one question.
Go
Did
ahead,
you want me
Leslie.
to start doing the review, making the review and post it? I had connectivity issues, so I missed the first part of what you.
That's all right. The review. I'm going to do the review. I'm going to Ansley. I'm going to need your help with the review sheet for the exam. I don't expect you to complete it on like right away. The exam is not ready. I will prepare it today. So I'll email you and ask you to do a review sheet. And if you could do it on by Tuesday, that would be awesome.
Okay, that works.
All right, quiz 11 is going to be our next to last quiz. We have only one quiz 12 remaining after this one is done, and quiz 12 is gonna be due after spring break. So I'm not gonna even open it before spring break so that you don't worry about anything on your break regarding this class anyways. But quiz 11 is going to be due next week on Wednesday, and we have the last participation assignment due today, so it's worth whopping 2 points, but be sure to get it. Last one. All right, moving on to the actual material. So this is the slide that I left off last time, and we are talking about biodiversity, what affects it, and how do we preserve it. So in order to understand how do we preserve it, we first need to kind of have an idea on about how we as humans affect biodiversity. And before we go into that, let's talk first. Let me give you some of the definitions. So, species biodiversity, there are several terms that are important to understand. So, the species are the species of varieties, the species diversity is dwindling, and some species are going extinct, some are endangered, and some are vulnerable. And these three bullet points give you the differences between the three terms. So extinction means that the last individual of a species has perished. So the species is no more. The endangered species has a high risk of extinction in the future. So, an endangered species is a species that has a drastic reduction in genetic diversity. And remember, when genetic diversity goes down, this is when the species can go extinct because with changing environmental conditions, the species has lower chance of surviving because of the reduced genetic diversity. And finally, a vulnerable species is a species that is likely to become extinct in the more distant future. So vulnerable species also usually has reduced genetic diversity as well as reduced population, but endangered species is kind of a more uh, serious condition than a vulnerable species. And this graph, as I mentioned in the last lecture, this graph shows the percentage of species that went extinct. So x-axis are the groups of organisms, denotes the groups of organisms, and y-axis is the percentage of threatened species in each group. I apologize, not extinct, threatened species in each group. So threatened means endangered. All right, and the kind of what strikes me in this graph is that a lot of vertebrates, these groups, so amphibians, mammals, birds, non-avian reptiles, and bony fishes, there are a lot of endangered species in these groups, and it sucks because we depend on them. we need them for healthy ecosystems, and the main reason why these species are endangered is the habitat loss, is the land conversion, converting forests to agriculture, pollution of waters, and so on. But I will go over all the various ways we affect biodiversity in the next few slides. So humans have a huge impact on species diversity and the effect on Earth ecosystems and terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems in general. So this map shows the population density across the globe. The warmer are the shades of the colors, the higher population density within these particular locations. So you see, in the US, the highest population density is in the eastern region and along the coasts in general. In Europe, Europe is densely populated all over, as well as India and eastern parts of China. And these ecosystems have been most drastically affected by human population because we build cities, we convert forests and grasslands into agriculture, and therefore we convert habitats, deprive species of their habitats, and species diversity declines. So what is the value of diversity to humans and ecosystems as a whole? Why do we need this species diversity, and why am I talking about it so much? Why not just have cities and agricultural land and live happily ever after? Well, uh, the very straightforward answer to that, and the very like on the surface example, is basically we need something to pollinate the crops. We need insects. We need to preserve diversity of insects so they can fly around and pollinate the crops so that we can eat. If there is no insects, we don't have basically grain, we don't have fruit, we don't have anything. Technically, if you've ever grown anything in your home, you know that technically you can pollinate them yourself. You can take a Q-tip and like I've done it with, I used to grow peppers, and I've done it with the peppers. I would go around with a Q-tip and cross-pollinate different plants. But this is just a few plants, right? You cannot possibly make humans going to the fields with the little Q-tips and cross-pollinate all these different plants. So insects are doing a tremendous ecological service to us by doing this tedious work for us and allowing us to have food to eat. So insects need places to live, they need places to breed, and they don't do it in croplands, they do it in other areas. So, and if we deprive them from the habitats that would allow them to live and breed, we deprive ourselves from that ecological service as well. Also, climate needs to be livable. Okay, we don't want our area to be too hot, and we don't want our area to be too cold, and we don't want it to be droughty. We want plenty of rainfall to kind of water the crops, so we don't rely on the groundwater, which is, by the way, is going lowish. um, so to get rainfall, basically, we need to cut back on deforestation, in particularly deforestation in the Amazonian in the Amazonian region and tropical rainforests in general. So within tropical rainforests, tropical rainforests evaporate, provide lots of moisture to the atmosphere, and the rainfall that the moisture kind of is distributed all over from the tropical rainforests. So a lot of moisture is deposited right back, but a lot of moisture is also carried to the north and to the south from the tropical rainforest and is deposited in other locations. So when the tropical rainforests are converted to pastures or agriculture, there is much less moisture that is evaporated from these regions. And as a result, there was a paper in Science Journal or Nature Journal a couple of years ago showing that deforestation in the Amazon affects the droughts in the US. Okay, so this illustrates how everything is connected, and like decision of some country to reduce the forests and convert them to agriculture or pasture, to cropland or pasture, affects the climate in very different places on the globe. So we also need somewhere to live. We need to build houses, and usually houses are built out of wood. So we need the forests for wood, and we need the forests to keep existing in order for us to have more in order for us to have building materials to build houses. So we need to we need to implement the sustainable forest management practices in order for the forest to keep providing this ecological service of wood to us. Okay. And last but not least, it's aesthetically pleasing to watch diverse animals do their thing. And it's aesthetically pleasing to experience various ecosystems. It would be much more depressing to see only croplands or urban areas over and over and over again. Okay, it's very pleasant to be. It's aesthetically pleasing to be able to go out into the woods and take a hike in the woods. It's aesthetically pleasing to go to the coast and experience kind of wild coastal areas. So it's it's kind of non-monetary value. It's hard to assign monetary value to this aesthetic pleasure, but it's a part of life, and it's a pleasant part of life that would suck if we did not have it anymore. So conservation biologists study preservation of biodiversity, and humans affect the ecosystem, the biodiversity a lot, as I've touched over and over, as I mentioned over and over and over again. So the cause of the biodiversity loss can be abbreviated into this HIPPO abbreviation, okay? And HIPPO stands for habitat loss and destruction, introduction of invasive species, increasing population of humans, pollution, and overexploitation. So this HIPPO abbreviation basically summarizes all the reasons why biodiversity on Earth is dwindling. And next, I'm going to go through each individual reason of the reduction of biodiversity. So many human activities destroy habitats. Habitat destruction is the primary threat to biodiversity. Humans have altered more than 50% of the land, replacing prairies, wetlands, and forests with farms, rangelands, and cities. So prairies and forests are extremely fertile, meaning they have this rich humic layer of soil that can sustain, that can produce lots of yield when you plant something there for food. Tropical rainforest does not have a very fertile soil. However, it is widely used. So when you cut down tropical rainforest and plant, I don't know, grain crop in there, you're not going to get much yield. So the tropical rainforests are usually converted to pastures. And some of them are converted to crops, but these crops require lots and lots of fertilizers to keep growing. Much more than crops planted in formerly prairies or grasslands. So wood is used. We cut down forests and use wood for houses and other wood products. And cities, when we build cities, when we convert a forest or a prairie or some coastal area into cities, we a lot of times we change how the water flows, and changing the water flow and as a consequence, the lack of water to ecosystems kind of changes ecosystem types as well. So the water may have flown through a region before, now it doesn't, and what was formerly wetland is now something else. And I don't have to go far to give you an example. A very prominent example of changing waterways and changing hydrologic regime is in South Florida. So South Florida used to be all wetland, okay? But people decided that maybe it would be nice to build houses here, and lots of people are moving to Florida, right? So, and to sustain, keep providing them with housing, whole of the hydrologic regime of whole South Florida was changed drastically. The water was diverted from the land, and lots of land was converted from wetlands to urban areas. So now it's much drier as it was, and as a result, lots of species could not really survive there. I had to move to different islands of habitat. So human activities destroy forests, and deforestation is basically the removal of all trees from a forested area, which alters level of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So why is it bad? Why is deforestation bad apart from destroying the habitat? Basically, the answer lies right here and right here. If we destroy forests, if we cut all these plants out, remember plants consume CO2 and they emit oxygen and a little bit of CO2, but mostly they uptake CO2 from suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere and in return provide oxygen. Okay. And if we could, the forests are often called lungs of the planet. So if you cut down forests, you also reduce the rate of emission of oxygen into the atmosphere. So what else? Also, when you cut down forests, you reduce the rate of uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. And as I mentioned during last lecture, CO2 has been increasing exponentially because we burn all the fossil fuels, and CO2 is also a greenhouse gas, meaning it's warming up. It's warming up our climate. So if there are no trees to suck up CO2 from the atmosphere, the rate of warming will accelerate because more CO2 will remain in the atmosphere from year to year. Wood from trees stores and releases carbon when burned. So if there is a forest fire or during deforestation, during harvesting, lots of times the unusable wood, a wood that cannot be used in the industry, is just burned. Okay, and this burning of wood releases all the stored carbon in the wood back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Also, the changing climate also changes fire regimes. So we have more droughts in general because of the deforestation, because of the warming of the atmosphere. So these, as a result of these droughts and warmer temperatures, we have more frequent and severe fires, particularly in the northern regions. And when these fires sweep across the forest land, they convert carbon stored in organic matter of wood into inorganic form, into CO2, okay, and CO, carbon monoxide, and those things kind of stay in the atmosphere and contribute to accelerated warming of the climate. Uh, so how to improve our management, basically, of forests? If we need to log them, like uh, one of the improvements in logging practices is called selective logging. So we don't cut down all trees. We select the trees that we want to cut down for wood products and leave the rest alone. It's more expensive, but the upside of that is it's basically better for the biome, for the forest biome. So it's tough to find an alternative for agricultural land if population keeps increasing. But the current solution, and I think I've mentioned this before, the current solution to reduce land use conversion to agricultural land is basically find ways to increase crop yield with the land we have right now for agriculture. And it's basically, the answer is in genetic modification of plants to increase crop yields. We've already done it, and we kind of keep doing it. We keep finding ways to increase it. But we as consumers of food can also contribute to reduction of the land conversion into for agricultural use, for cropland use. Uh, And the way we can do that is stop throwing away food, plan better what we eat and how much we eat. Because currently, 1/3 of food that is grown is tossed. And think about it, like 33% of food that is grown ends up in the dumpster. So if we kind of plan better how much we're going to buy and eat, and if less food is going to end up in the dumpster, we are kind of contributing to less land conversion from the prairie ecosystems or from forest lands to croplands. So every one of us can contribute to increase in biodiversity by seemingly, unrelated behaviors. Okay. Any questions so far, guys? All right, moving on. So, all of Earth's ecosystems are affected by human activities, and grasslands and forests are shrinking worldwide as unsustainable agriculture eats away at forests and savannas. Freshwater habitats in general are vulnerable to destruction by dams, levees, and waterway redirections. So we as humans have done a lot for rerouting the flow of rivers to eliminate periodic flooding. So flooding is natural. Flooding in the rivers happens quite often, and it's good for the ecosystems because flooding distributes the nutrient rich sediments across the floodplain, and this is why we have lots and lots of fertile land in the river valleys. However, people are not very interested in flooding because people tend to build houses by the waterways, and they don't want their houses to flood, which makes a lot of sense. So for us, but the changing the flow of the rivers changes the rates of flow of the rivers, and as a result, the river habitat itself is changing. And it's not able to support this. The rivers with higher flow are not able to support the same kind of species and the same kind of species diversities that live in the river as the rivers with the slower flow. So the species composition and abundance changes as a result of increase in the rate of flow of the river. Also, the faster river flow contributes to erosion of sediments. So in the riverbed, there's lots and lots of sediment, which in itself is a habitat for lots and lots of species. So the faster river flow, it kind of eats away at that sediment. So not much stuff is sedimented anymore. Instead, sediment is exported down the river, and as a result of loss of the habitats, the sediment habitat, we are losing species from there as well. Now, moving to the P, the first P out of the HIPPO abbreviation. So first P stands for pollution, and pollution degrades habitat. And pollution is any chemical, physical, or biological change in the environment that harms living organisms. It degrades the quality of air, water, and land, threatening biodiversity worldwide. Uh, Fairly recent news, I mean, it was out, I think, in 2019, is that sunscreens ruin corals. And in fact, the state of Hawaii has banned the sunscreens containing oxybenzone. So sunscreens containing zinc oxide are fine. Zinc oxide is like inorganic material that is not that does not affect the living organisms that much. But oxybenzone, which is sunscreens with oxybenzone are more convenient because like zinc oxide, it leaves the white residue, right? So people like oxybenzone containing sunscreens better. But oxybenzone has found to, first, it has found to affect human endocrine system. And second, it has found to ruin the coral habitats. It negatively affects the biodiversity and longevity of species and organisms in corals. So that's why the state of Hawaii banned it, and I think Florida should do the same uh, for the sake of health of people and the species diversity in marine ecosystems. We also there's another big issue with pollution in aquatic habitats is pharmaceuticals and plastics. So we treat the water. So the water that we kind of flush and that goes down the drain eventually ends up in water treatment plants. With pharmaceuticals, we can flush pharmaceuticals, but more importantly, whenever we ingest some pharmaceuticals for whatever conditions we are having, uh, pharmaceuticals have to leave the body too. Then they leave the body through urine or through feces, which ends up in the waterways. So before leaving the city, the water is treated at the water treatment plants, and the raw sewage is treated with bacteria. So bacteria are helping out clean up the water, and they eat the organic molecules contained in the water before the water is released downstream to the next city to consume, to treat and consume, or before it's released into the ocean. Um, so, pharmaceuticals and toxic compounds, like motor oil, for example, may kill the bacteria that treats the water at the water treatment plants. And no bacteria, no cleaning up the water. Okay, water becomes dirtier when it leaves the treatment plant if there are no bacteria. So, what else we're releasing? We're releasing. Uh, I'm going to talk about it later because I'm having in my notes here. Uh, I'm going to talk about it a little later. So, any question about the water treatment plants and like how pharmaceuticals and plastics affect? Well, I talked about pharmaceuticals. So plastics are another big issue. Right now, plastics have been found in basically all of the organisms, and I'm talking specifically about microplastics. And because we are using so much plastic, and so much plastic is basically everywhere, and it turns out that everywhere includes fish, everywhere includes like all of the food that we eat, and everywhere includes our own bodies. So everything in the environment is now full of microplastic. um, it turns out, and it's also a fairly recent study, and it's fairly concerning. Any questions about this stuff? Okay, moving on. The water pollution causes a phenomenon called eutrophication, which eutrophication in itself means nutrient water becoming more nutrient rich. So addition of excess nutrients via sewage, fertilizers, and animal waste changes the ecological balance of water bodies. The nutrients basically allow overgrowth of microbes, leading to the depletion of oxygen in the water. So let me talk about the example pictured here. Okay, so the area in yellow in this map is the area where there are a lot of croplands, and where there are croplands, there are fertilizers. So we have to fertilize croplands a lot in order to get high yields, and we fertilize with inorganic forms of nitrogen and phosphorus. So the more nitrogen and phosphorus we put in, the healthier the plants are looking, and the better crop yield we get. However, people often over fertilize crops, and the nitrogen inorganic forms of nitrogen and phosphorus that are not used up, that are not immobilized in plant organic matter, they are exported with runoff into the streams fall into rivers, and the rivers eventually end up in the ocean. Okay, so all of the inorganic nitrogen and phosphorus that was exported with runoff in the Mississippi River drainage basin, it ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. So nitrogen and phosphorus, plants love nitrogen and phosphorus, as do algae. So algae live in the waters, okay, in the ocean as well as lakes and rivers. But since all of the nitrogen and phosphorus is running off into the Gulf of Mexico, I'm going to focus on the ocean water. So algae in the ocean water are limited by phosphorus, and when they love nitrogen as well, but usually there is a lot of nitrogen in the water, but not enough of phosphorus for the algae to thrive. So whenever there's lots of phosphorus, when lots of phosphorus ends up in the Gulf, the algae start multiplying. They sense that, oh, apparently there's lots of food and nutrients in the water. Yay, let's multiply and live happily ever after. And they do, but not for long. And all of these algae are accumulating in the water. And what happens next is the zooplankton, which preys on algae, it starts multiplying as well because zooplankton realizes, oh my God, look at all this food, look at all these algae, and they start consuming algae. And the problem with that is that zooplankton, it consumes all of the oxygen from the surface layers of the water, and eventually it dies. Okay, and algae die because zooplankton consumes algae, and zooplankton that consumed algae erupts in population and consumes all of the oxygen in the surface layer of the water. And because all of the oxygen in the surface layer of the water is depleted, the fish suffocate because none of the oxygen gets to the bottom layers of the water where fish live. Okay, and as a result of the oxygen depletion from the surface layers of the water, we have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. But what originally caused it is the surface runoff of the inorganic forms of phosphorus and nitrogen from the croplands. So this is how fascinating ecosystem ecology is. It basically studies the links of various things, you know. So like unless people could not have predicted that this is going to happen before it actually happened, and this is kind of this is kind of things that prompted high high growth in the field of ecology, high amounts of funding in the field of ecology to study the ecosystem interactions to prevent these kind of dead zone kind of events in the future. So we know how ecosystem components interact with each other and are able to make more informed decisions in our everyday life. Okay, so this is kind of a very good example of how ecosystem components interact with each other and can cause catastrophic consequences if we're not careful. Any questions about this example here? Is what is confusing about this to you guys? Okay, and I have a couple of pictures here that I took on a flight from Vancouver Island to the mainland. And Vancouver Island is located near Seattle. Okay, Vancouver Island is in Canada. Seattle is in the Pacific Northwest. So this is taken from a plane going over the mainland of British Columbia. And you see there's a lot of croplands here. Okay, and the brown stuff here is all of the sediment that has run off from the croplands here into the water. So the sediment in brown is full of inorganic nitrogen and phosphorus, and it causes algal blooms, which you can see here. So the water from above, you see these greenish strikes in here, and this is the beginning of the algal bloom. Okay, I see a question from Ava who is asking, is the dead zone permanently dead or can it be revived eventually? It is revived eventually. Like when the runoff slows down, when supply of nitrogen and phosphorus goes down, the algae biomass also goes down, and usually it happens like when the water is colder and when basically fields are not fertilized in the winter, right? So kind of the severity of the dead zone, it fluctuates, and if we stop over fertilizing, it eventually can recover back to what it was before. Well, hopefully. I cannot state that for certain because I have not studied the species diversity in the dead zone, but if assuming that the species were not totally eliminated, it can potentially be recovered. Alexander asks, so is it possible to avoid nitrogen and phosphorus runoff? Yes, it is. Again, whatever nitrogen and phosphorus is carried with the runoff, it is the nitrogen and phosphorus that was not used up by plants. So nitrogen and phosphorus, basically, the key thing to understand here is we over fertilize crops. So studies right now are lots of studies are aimed at identifying that perfect amount of nitrogen and phosphorus to apply to fields to reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus concentration in the runoff water. Because if most of the nitrogen and phosphorus is used up by a plant, it's not going to be carried away with the runoff. So the key thing is to basically identify, not apply just, throw all the nitrogen and phosphorus we have in the field and see what sticks. It's important to really carefully apply some particular dosage of nitrogen and phosphorus, and maybe also space it out in a way that that is not going to be washed away right away. So like if you apply nitrogen and phosphorus and then in the morning and then in the afternoon it rains, all of it is going to be washed out. So it's important also to strategically apply nitrogen and phosphorus when it's not going to be washed out the same day. That seems like it would be a good job to have in the future. Yes, and it's a good job to have now too. So like within the agricultural sciences, it's very, very lucrative jobs located like are in that sector, both in the area of plant physiology, in genetic molecular biology, excuse my brain fart, and ecosystem ecology. So and crop modeling, I should say. I work in the area of fusion of mathematics and ecology, so I develop mathematical models, and I know that in the agriculture, people pay big bucks for developing yield models, crop yield models. Sarah asks, so what makes the croplands dead? Croplands are not dead. So the dead adjective I used here is to describe the zone in the Gulf of Mexico. The dead zone is in the aquatic ecosystem. The croplands are alive and kicking. Okay, people are not gonna let the croplands die because we depend on them for food. Okay. Sarah, did that make sense? Or Sarah? Or did I misunderstand your question? Feel free to unmute yourself and clarify. Okay. So another big thing is that water pollution is subject to biomagnification because a lot of pollutants are fat soluble. So does anybody remember what biomagnification is from the Wednesday's lecture?
It's where like organisms eat and then they maintain some of those chemicals, or I think it was like metal in some cases, and then we eat those animals and then we receive those
Yes.
elements as well.
Exactly. So biomagnification. Oh, Dylan, I see you talking, but I cannot hear you. Nope, nothing. So biomagnification occurs when a chemical is ingested, is eaten, but not excreted. And biomagnification, basically, the chemical is magnified as you go up the trophic level. So in the lowest level, in the lowest trophic level, if the concentration of the lowest trophic level is like 1 gram, in the highest trophic level, in the one trophic level higher, it can be 100 grams. If over lifetime an organism consumes like 100 individuals containing 1 gram of a chemical. Okay, so when the chemical is accumulated but not excreted, is ingested but not excreted, it accumulates over a lifetime and biomagnifies up the food chain. Okay, so in the picture here, we see lots of visible pollution, but what we don't see are the chemicals that are dissolved in water and are not visible to the eye, like microplastics, for instance. So these waters are basically more polluted that meets the eye, and water leaches chemicals from plastics and other garbage, and many of these chemicals biomagnify in the ecosystems. So we don't only pollute the air. We don't only pollute the water. We also pollute the air. And air pollution causes many types of damage. The visible kind of damage that it causes, well, when we can see air above the cities, it's most likely due to smog. And smog is a type of air pollution that forms a visible haze in the lower atmosphere. Okay, in the UK in the early 20th century, people were kind of getting sick very often because of the smog. And the smog formed in the UK in the early 20th century because of the burning of coal for heat. So coal burning releases sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides into the air, and these particles basically turn into smog, into this toxic haze. So industrial smog occurs in urban and industrial regions where power plants, factories, and households burn coal and oil. So these nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides, they also react with water when it rains, causing acid rain. So this acid deposition affects both aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. So when acid rain falls onto terrestrial ecosystems, we can often see that, well, not anymore, but in the 70s and 80s in the US at least, after acid rains, you can see that trees might lose leaves, and below grounds, basically soil is depleted of nutrients. So more acidic environments, they cause the leaching of the nutrients from the soil. And as a result, soils become more poor in nutrients, and they are not able to support as much plant growth than before the acid rain. So acid rainfall also affects aquatic ecosystems, and it literally makes the water more acidic in the aquatic ecosystems. And as a result, fish, insects, and aquatic plants may die, damaging the food web within the aquatic systems. And there's another small example here, but important one is that acidic environments makes the fish eggs not hatch because it kind of damages the eggs. So these are the effects of acid rain. And again, acid rain is caused by emissions of sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides from fossil fuel burning. So coal is a fossil fuel, oil is a fossil fuel. Often in big cities, by the way, in big cities, smog is formed from car emissions. Now the cars are better, like the exhaust from cars is better than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So that kind of helped the smog situation. But still, smog often forms in the valleys like LA. Is it LA? I'm not sure which city it is, but I know that in Los Angeles, there's a big problem with smog. So another pollutant that we emit is called ozone, chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. The problem with CFCs is that they ruin the ozone layer in the Earth atmosphere. So ozone is a molecule composed of 3 atoms of oxygen, and the ozone in the troposphere, or the upper layers of the atmosphere, it blocks the UV radiation in the upper atmosphere, and it protects us from the harmful UV rays. So UV rays that do reach the Earth's surface, they're kind of a dampened version, a light version, what actually is sent to the Earth's surface by the sun. So the emissions of the chlorofluorocarbons that are often used in refrigeration industry and other aerosol products, these CFCs basically cause the ozone hole over Antarctica. And in 1987, the leaders of the countries got together in Montreal and agreed to limit the use of CFCs in industry. So since 1987, lots of countries adopted this so-called Montreal Protocol and reduced their emissions in CFCs. And as a result, this ozone hole, and it's not shown here, but in the recent years, the ozone hole has shown to be a bit patched up. So it's not as bad as it used to be as a result of countries adopting this Montreal Protocol and reducing CFC emission. So this is an example how basically countries can come together and reduce the pollution of the environment for the common good. Okay. A similar kind of thing has been reached in Paris Agreement, which basically is aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions by the countries around the world. And this reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is for the common good, and the common good meaning limiting changing climate. We don't want the climate to change because climate change can cause lots of unpredictable responses from the ecosystems, unpredictable and what is more scary, non-linear responses from the ecosystems. So we want to stick with what we know, with the climate we know, because the climate we don't know may not be very kind to us. So speaking of climate, global climate change alters and shifts habitats. Greenhouse gases are potentially the most harmful air pollutants of all. And the examples of the greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, and along with some other gases like nitrous oxide and even water vapor. They create the greenhouse effect. So, and a greenhouse effect is an effect where you trap the heat from the sun in the atmosphere. So lots of sunlight comes to the Earth's surface, and lots of sunlight is reflected from the Earth's surface, and some of the heat is also reflected. But within the Earth's atmosphere, the greenhouse gases like methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide, they reflect these reflected heat back onto Earth. And this is called the greenhouse gas effect, where there's an insulation layer in the Earth atmosphere that prevents the heat from escaping. So greenhouse gases warm Earth's surface, and the big example that I've used over and over again of a greenhouse gas is the carbon dioxide, which has been steadily accumulating in the atmosphere for the past century. And most of it comes from the use of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. And the rise of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is accompanied by an increase in average global temperatures. And this graph illustrates this phenomenon. So on x-axis, we have years. On one y-axis, we have temperatures in green. And on another y-axis, we have CO2 concentrations in blue. Okay, so we see that CO2 concentrations have been rising exponentially, and so what is the average temperatures around, I believe it's around the globe. So the temperatures are more variable than CO2 concentrations, and that is because lots of other things affect the temperatures. Like temperatures are generally lowering because there was, for instance, volcano eruption that released lots of reflecting particles into the air. And if there are lots of reflective particles in the air that reflects the incoming sunlight, the temperatures cool down. But as a result, it gets a bit darker too. And when there were no volcano eruptions, the temperatures continued to rising. And I'm kind of simplifying what affects the temperature here. There's lots of other things that do affect the temperature, but the important thing is that you can see correlation between the rises in the temperature, exponential rises in the average temperatures, and exponential rise in greenhouse gas concentration. The CO2 concentration right now is measured in lots of places, but this particular measurement comes from the volcano in the station that measures CO2 in volcano in Hawaii, and it has been measured there since 1958, I believe. But you see that some data comes from earlier, and these data come from ice cores taken in Antarctica. So ice cores kind of provide the look into the past CO2 concentrations, and the way the CO2 is analyzed from ice cores is basically the bubbles of air are extracted from ice cores and analyzed for the CO2 content. And I see I went a little bit over. It's 10:21 a.m. So I'll take any last minute questions. And otherwise, if there are no questions, I'll finish up the lecture on Monday, guys. So any questions about this so far? Austin asks, yeah, I can explain acid rain again. So we consider burning of coal. When you burn coal, you get all of the smoke that is emitted, okay? And the smoke contains carbon dioxide, the smoke contains carbon monoxide, but apart from those things, it also contains nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxide. Sulfur oxide reacts with water in the rainfall or water vapor in the atmosphere. And if that water vapor condenses into rainfall and falls back, basically SO2 or NO3 plus H2O forms an acid. Okay, so this gas plus water equals acid, and this acid falls to the ground with rainfall. Did that make sense, Austin? Feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, so greenhouse gas is basically, greenhouse gases are trapping heat, and nitrous oxide and sulfur oxide are not greenhouse gases. They are gases that cause acid rain, whereas CO2 and methane are greenhouse gases that do not cause acid rain. They cause increases in temperature by trapping heat reflected from Earth. All right. Thanks for joining, guys, and I'll see you on Monday.